There are moments in history when the whole world seems to hold its breath. Two of those moments came on two different oceans, 2 years apart, and the men and women who lived through them never forgot the sound of engines overhead or the silence that followed. This is the story of how the tide turned. It begins in June of 1942, on a speck of land so small you could miss it on any map. Midway, two coral islands, a scattering of birds, and a runway that the United States had carved out of the middle of the Pacific. To the men stationed there, it was nothing fancy, but it was theirs. They called it the front yard of America, the last outpost between the enemy and the long stretch of ocean that led home. And in those final days of spring, everyone on that island could feel that something was coming. A Navy patrol plane lifted off at first light the way it did every morning. Routine, the crews told themselves, just another circle over an empty sea. But there was nothing routine about that week, and they knew it. Behind every cloud there might be an enemy fleet. The birds along the shoreline seemed restless, lifting and wheeling for no reason anyone could name, and the older hands swore the animals always sensed it before the men did. There was something in the air, something behind the sunset. Then in the dark before dawn, the great planes came in low over the lagoon. Flying fortresses, four-engine bombers that had crossed enormous distances to land on that tiny strip, and the moment they touched down, everyone understood the waiting was over. A council of war was called. Officers bent over maps lit by hooded lamps, tracing the position the patrol planes had reported. An enemy fleet out there in the gray water, steaming toward them with everything it had. Watch the young pilot climbing into his fortress, and you might think of someone from your own street. There was a boy named Will Kenny, from Springfield, Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone. His father had given 38 years to the railroad. His mother was like any mother in any American town, and his sister was about as pretty as they came. And here was Will, half a world away, climbing into the cockpit of an enormous bomber as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Good luck, son, God bless you." Then the engines roared, the props bit into the wind, and one by one the heavy aircraft heaved themselves off the runway and out toward the enemy. What followed was 3 days of fury spread across 300 miles of open ocean. Navy planes thundered off the pitching decks of the carriers. Army bombers climbed into the flak. Marine pilots dove on the enemy fleet again and again, pulling up through black bursts of anti-aircraft fire only to turn and come back for more. Out on the water, the warships had done their part, slowing the enemy advance, drawing the fleet into a place where it could be caught. And then the trap was sprung. The invasion force that had set out so confidently toward Midway was hit, and hit, and hit again. Wave after wave of American aircraft fell upon the enemy carriers until the back of that great fleet was broken in the sea. It is one thing to read those words on a page. It is another to imagine the men inside those planes, boys really, doing arithmetic with their own lives, knowing that some of them would not be coming back and going anyway. And then they came home from the day's work, the way neighbors come home in the evening. There was a flyer named Jimmy Thatch, 7 enemy flags painted on the side of his plane, climbing down onto the deck and grinning at the question everyone wanted to ask. "How many more today, Skipper?" On Midway itself, the islanders who had been told they would be liberated by the enemy went about their day exactly as free as they had always been. The front yard had held. But the battle does not end when the shooting stops. For some men it had only begun. Day after day, the patrol planes went back out over that endless water, searching every tiny reef, every distant mile of empty sea, looking for the ones who had fought to their last round of ammunition and flown to their last drop of fuel and then gone down into the ocean. 8 days, 9, 10 days without food or fresh water, drifting under a sun that gave no mercy. And still the searchers flew, because somewhere out there a man might be waiting on a scrap of raft for the sound of an engine that meant he was not forgotten. Then against every odd they began to find them. A speck on the water that turned out to be a man, a hand raised toward the sky. The first thing one of them asked for was a cigarette, and that first drag after 11 days alone with the sea tasted like life itself. They came back one at a time, men with names and hometowns and families waiting on news. "Get them to the hospital," the rescuers said. "Get them clean cots and cool sheets, doctors and medicine and a nurse with soft hands. Hurry." And there was a hospital, clean and orderly, 100 beds with the Red Cross marked plainly on the roof. Not everyone came back. The morning after, men gathered beside a crater that had once been a chapel, and held divine services in the open air. At evening they buried their dead with the last salute from the comrades and the officers who had fought beside them. They sang the old hymn, the one about the land of liberty, voices rough and quiet under that wide Pacific sky. "Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light." It was the only kind of grief soldiers are allowed, brief and dignified, before the war demanded them again. Now carry that same feeling 2 years forward and half a world away to the gray coastline of northern Europe, where the next great trial was waiting. In England, in quiet rooms far from the front, a general named Dwight Eisenhower bent over his own maps with his deputy commanders, deciding when and where the armies of a dozen nations would strike. Across the water lay the continent the enemy had conquered, and along its coast they had built something they believed could never be broken. They called it the West Wall, the Atlantic Wall, and into it they had poured 4 years of labor, much of it forced from the people of the very countries they had overrun. Steel and concrete sunk deep into the cliffs, every weapon of defense that had ever been invented aimed out at the sea, waiting for the day the Allies would dare to come. The enemy filmed their own fortifications to impress the world with how strong they were. Whether all that steel was enough to stop what was coming would be settled soon on the beaches themselves. On the other side of that narrow channel sat Britain, and Britain had become one vast armed camp. Tanks and trucks and guns from across the Atlantic, from the United States and Canada, stacked and parked and hidden under every hedgerow. 4 years of planning and production had come down to this. There were locomotives built to run on continental rails, freight cars and tank cars ready to replace everything the enemy had destroyed, waiting only for a coast to be won so they could roll inland. And in the harbors an armada was gathering, ship after ship after ship, steel hulls of every description built for one mission and one mission only. Nothing was left to chance. Every loading operation was rehearsed and timed. Every soldier learned his station by heart, knew exactly where he fit into a pattern so enormous that no single man could see the whole of it. Day after day they boarded their ships, and for all most of them knew they were bound for France or Belgium, or wherever the men with the maps had decided to strike. Every jeep, every tank, every machine had its assigned place in a plan years in the making. Then, on the 5th day of June 1944, more than 4,000 ships put out from England into the open sea. It fell, by a strange turn of the calendar, on the 4th anniversary of the bitter retreat from the beaches of Dunkirk, where years before the Allies had been driven into the water. Now they were going back. The great fleet was underway, and there was no turning it around. The morning of the 6th of June, the sky over Normandy filled with the sound of engines. More than 11,000 aircraft led the way, vast squadrons of bombers and transports spearheading the assault. Paratroopers spilled out into the dark behind the coastal defenses, dropping with a timing and precision that had been bought only through endless rehearsal back in England. On the water the landing barges churned toward shore, some of them already firing their guns and rockets before the ramps even dropped. This was the day free people had waited for through years of darkness. This was the day a lost continent began to be won back, 1 yard of bloody sand at a time. And once the foothold was taken, the real work of holding it began. On a strip of captured ground, engineers laid a runway in record time, threw up a barrage balloon to guard it, and within 2 days of the landings the first transport planes were dropping out of the sky to land on French soil. They came to take the wounded home. The first casualties were carried to the ambulance aircraft, and among the crews were American nurses, the first women of the entire invasion force to set foot in France, 6 to a plane, steady-handed in the noise and the dust. They flew the wounded back across the channel under fighter escort, treating men in the air as they went, threading blood plasma into the arms of the badly hurt while the engines droned beneath them. Among the wounded carried out were enemy prisoners and injured French civilians too, because mercy on that airstrip did not stop to ask which uniform a man had worn. Overhead the fighters never rested. Mustangs swept out across the channel day after day, hunting the enemy in the air and hammering his airfields and rail lines on the ground. You can almost see it through the gun cameras of those pilots. The moment an enemy fighter is caught, the long ribbon of smoke, the parachute blooming as a man bails out into the empty sky. And the medium bombers, the Marauders, came in low over the invasion fleet and passed the beaches to strike at the enemy massing inland. They bombed from barely 2,000 feet to make their aim true, low enough that the crews felt their own aircraft shudder from the concussion of their bombs. The fighting around the inland towns was the worst of it. Near a place called Caen, one of the enemy's great strongholds, the bombers struck the woods where tanks and troops lay hidden, sometimes hitting positions the enemy had crept into only hours before in the dark to refuel. Allied soldiers were pulled back from the edge of the target before each strike, and then the bombs came down on the trees and the bridges and the rail lines, cutting the enemy off from the front a piece at a time. On the way home, the crews passed over the Bay of the Seine and saw it crowded with yet another fleet, more ships, more men, more steel pouring in behind them. The invasion was not a single morning, it was a tide that would not stop rising. 2 oceans, 2 years apart, a coral outpost in the Pacific and a fortress coastline in Europe. They looked like different wars fought by different men in different skis, but they were the same story. They were the story of ordinary people, the railroad man's son from Springfield, the nurse stepping off a transport into a war zone, the flyer drifting 11 days on the open sea, who were asked to do something no one should ever have to do, and who did it anyway. The back of one fleet broken at Midway, the door of a continent forced open at Normandy. And in between, in the quiet that came after the engines went silent, the buried dead and the rescued living, the hymns sung beside the craters, the cigarettes shared on rescue rafts. That is what victory cost, not in maps and arrows but in young men climbing into cockpits when their hands wanted to shake, in mothers waiting on news that came too slowly, in the long, patient search across an empty sea for anyone who might still be alive. The tide turned because they turned it, and they paid for every inch of it. The least we can do, all these years later, is remember exactly what it was made of.